Buongiorno a tutti e buon pomeriggio. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eliana La Ferrara. I'm a professor of development economics here at Bocconi, and I direct the LEAP, Laboratory for Effective Anti-Poverty Policies. I'm going to speak English in this part of the event because this is where our international speakers are going to help us remember Luca in a very special way. Luca was a Bocconi student, and I think he represents the type of person that we aim to train and to help go out in the world and make a difference. Many of our students today are looking up to him as an example, as a role model. And many of the people who do research nowadays, including what we try to do within the LEAP, are really trying to put our thinking to the service of actors who can shape policy based on evidence that research helps generate. So the way that we thought we could remember him within an academic institution is to give voice to three of the most influential thinkers on the political economy of African development, the three of the world experts on the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is the country where Luca has been working and doing so much in the last years of his life. And so I'm really looking forward to and honored to have the opportunity to have a discussion with these three researchers to try and understand and give some meaning to what happens in that part of the world. Okay? Many of us have opened our eyes to the conflict because of what happened to Luca, but it's been decades that this country has been torn by war. And the media doesn't cover it remotely as much as it should if our metric were the number of people who've been killed there. So through our research, we want to try and understand the causes of what is going on, and a better understanding of these causes will hopefully help us improve the situation and help governments and policymakers in their choices. So I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time as they speak. I would like to encourage all of you who are connected to type your questions in the chat. I will monitor it and occasionally raise some questions or leave them for the last part of the discussion. And as you will see, there is a progression in our discussion. The first part will be about the historical origins of the state in Congo. It has an institutional perspective, also long-term. Then we will try and dig deeper into rebel movements and the nature of rebellion in the Congo nowadays. And finally, we will conclude by putting a few pieces together that link not only local actors, but also economic interests on a global scale to what's been happening over the past years. So let me take no longer and start introducing the first speaker, Jim Robinson. Jim is the Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies and the Director of the Pearson Institute for the Study and Resolution of Global Conflict at University of Chicago. Jim is an extremely influential political scientist and economist. He's one of the leaders of institutional economics, has a really deep expertise in the political economy of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. Many of you may be familiar with a very important book that he wrote, Why Nation Fails. And one of the features of Jim's research in recent years has been an in-depth analysis of the Congo and how the type of state that we see nowadays can be linked to historical experiences. And this is what Jim is going to talk to us about today. So thank you so much, Jim, for giving us your time and sharing your knowledge on this topic.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm in Quindío in Colombia. Crazy happens, you know, I get attacked by parrots or my son, which may be worse than parrots. Then you'll have to be a little patient. Okay, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. There it is. Okay, so I feel a bit. I'm not sure I am an expert. I think I'm much more of an expert than I am. But I have worked in the West, in Kananga and Equateur a little bit, and I'm going to give you a sort of perspective, my own personal perspective, on, you know, why the Congolese state looks like it does. I think to a European, it seems very odd, you know, that you have this so much sort of disorder and an apparent vacuum of authority in the east of the DRC. But I want to sort of look at it from what I would think of as a kind of African perspective, a historical perspective of the political development of Central Africa. And from that, in that context, the architecture or the organization of the Congolese state, I'm going to say, actually makes quite a lot of sense. So let me sort of plow straight into it and say, you know, the great political historian of Central Africa was Jan van Sina, and van Sina kind of wrote many books about the history of the state in Central Africa, and he poses what he sees as the kind of, here's the fundamental issue in the fundamental political problem in Central Africa, which is Africans wanted to create states or structures to take advantage of scale and for people to cooperate and provide security, but they also very much valued their autonomy. Okay, and in his view, the development of political institutions was fundamentally shaped by people wanting to safeguard the internal autonomy of each community. That's the way he puts it. Okay, so it's true that did lead to, you know, the birth of some chiefdoms, even kingdoms. You know, in the Congo, the Kingdom of the Congo in the west, or in the Savannah, the Kuba Kingdom, the Lunda, the Luba. So states did develop, but he points out they also led to all sorts of different types of structures apart from states, different types of associations and organizations which were not states, but had some of the advantages of states, but at the same time preserved the autonomy of the community in a time of expansion. So this is what he said was the fundamental political problem. In the Eastern DRC, for example, a classic instance of what Van Sina was talking about would be the Lega people in the East. The Lega, prior to the colonial period, they didn't have a state, but they had a society called the Bwami Society. And the Bwami Society kind of encompassed Lega society, and it created the benefits of a state without being a state. So it was an alternative to a state, if you like. And all sorts of hybrid institutions emerged in Africa. And I think the one that I'm going to kind of elaborate on, which I find most useful for thinking about the Congolese state, is the notion developed by the anthropologist Aidan Southwell in the 1950s of a segmentary state. So what Southwell meant by a segmentary state was a sort of hybrid institution, a bit like the Bwami Society, where you know, in a traditional European way of thinking about the state, for example, you could imagine, you know, there was a king and authority was organized on the basis of kinship, and then that was replaced by a state. If you, for example, Geoffrey Elton's The Tudor Revolution in Government, which is the classic historical work of the development of the English state, the Tudor Revolution of Government comes when Henry VIII's personal relatives are replaced by professional bureaucrats in some sense. So it's the professionalization of the state which kind of marks the transition from kinship organization to something, you know, rational, legal, Weber would have said. But the idea of a segmentary state is not that you replace kinship with bureaucratic organization, but you sort of fuse the two. So in Southwell's view, and he was studying a people called the Alur in northwestern Uganda, who actually straddled the border with what's now the Eastern DRC, the Alor state was a fusion of kinship groups. So there was chiefs and there was organization, but they fused with kinship groups rather than replacing him. Okay, so this notion of the segmentary state is a kind of mixture. Okay, and I think this is a very powerful idea for understanding the current problems in the DRC. Okay, so it's a hybrid solution, which is a kind of reaction to this fundamental political problem that I described. And Southwell emphasizes a lot that there was a state and there was a king, but they had limited jurisdictions. Limited jurisdictions means there were some things you could do and some things you couldn't do. So what could the state do? Well, two big important things. Dispense supernatural power. Okay, so the Alor chiefs had particularly rain-making powers. This is not the Alor. This is from Mali, but I can't resist showing this. Here's a statue of a rainmaker. Rainmaking is very important historically in all over Africa, and this is a Telem rainmaker. This is from the Falaise de Bandiagara in Mali. But if you see a statue like this, it's probably a rainmaker. Okay, so supernatural power and impartial dispute resolution. So in the oral history of the Alor, there were lots of problems with disorder, and the Alor chiefs came in as a way as a way of impartially resolving disputes. They were outsiders originally, so that's very common in African history. They were what the great anthropologist, my late colleague Marshall Salins, calls stranger kings, and they were intrinsically limited. Were at limited jurisdictions. The Alor chiefs didn't own land. They had no right to taxation, very typical. They got tribute, very kind of carefully prescribed types of tribute, but they didn't have the right to tax, and they did not have the monopoly of violence. Okay, that's going to be critical for the discussion here. Okay, so later Southwell sort of tried to define what he meant by a segmentary state, and I think what's crucial to discussion here is he emphasizes a lot the distinction between a kind of core and a periphery. So he said a segmentary state is one where the spheres of ritual suzerainty. So what suzerainty means? It means it's a kind of tribute-like relationship. So when I think about the history of the English state, the English state, sort of when the state consolidates, in the period that, for example, Elton was talking about, the central state eliminates the Council of the North or the Council of the West. It eliminates kind of alternate decision makers, and it absorbs them into this centralized, bureaucratized structure. But that's not what a segmentary state looked like. The segmentary state had all sorts of autonomous units that were kind of integrated into this segmentary state, but had huge amounts of autonomy. Remember the importance of autonomy. So spheres of ritual suzerainty and political sovereignty do not coincide. The former extends everywhere. So there's a kind of ritual suzerainty. So there's an idea that we're all kind of integrated in something, but the latter, the political sovereignty, is confined to the central core domain. So think that the political sovereignty is concentrated in Kinshasa in the west. Ritual suzerainty extends everywhere in the Congo, including in the Kivus. But that's something very different from having consolidated political control. There's some kind of ritual control, but there isn't real political control. Okay? Here he notes from his 56th book, the monopoly of the use of force was successfully claimed to a limited extent. Okay? So, and it inheres in all the peripheral foci. So in a traditional definition of the state, in social science, in sociology, in Western sociology, you say, the state is the entity that has the legitimate monopoly of violence. But a hybrid state, like a segmentary state, never had the monopoly of violence, legitimate or illegitimate. It also inheres in all the peripheral foci. So force and monopoly of violence there's no monopoly of violence. Violence is spread, and many different actors have legitimate use to use violence. Okay, so I think that's very important to stress, because that's so contrary to our ideas in the West of like what a state should be, or even what state consolidation looks like. But I think the way to understand this is from this African perspective, that you're trying to build institutions which preserve the autonomy of the local community, as Vansina put it. Okay, so that's a historical thing. You know, Southall was collecting information in the late 1940s or early 1950s. What about post-colonialism? What about the current Congolese state? So my argument is that actually I'm going to talk about President Mobutu. The current Congolese state looks a lot like a segmentary state to me, and I would say that explains a lot about, you know, why the East looks the way it does, and why it doesn't look like, you know, what we'd expect it to look like from the European perspective. So you know, how did Mobutu build a state? Okay, in the mid-1960s, Mobutu takes over in the Congo for 32 years. You know, he built a state. What did that state look like? So my argument is that it looks a lot like a segmentary state. Okay, I would say, you know, without being an apologist for President Mobutu, he had a heck of a difficult problem to solve. You know, the Alumnus state was very small scale. Most of these states were very small scale. Suddenly there was this thing called the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Zaire as Mobutu called it. And he had to find a way of governing this enormous thing. And he looked around for models. You know, there were many models in post-colonial Africa. You know, there was a very different model in Sierra Leone or in Tanzania or Ghana. There was a socialist model. There were many types of models. But many people also, in some sense, tried to scale up this idea of a segmentary state and get it working at this new level of aggregation. That was a very difficult thing to do, because in many ways this was very personalized, you know, with the emphasis on the fusion of lineages and kinship groups with centralized administration. That left a lot of it's a very personalized way of doing things. That's very hard to operate at scale, and I think that actually explains a lot of many things, I mean, post-colonial Congo. But let me just sort of make a few comparisons between the Mobutu state and the Alumnus state. Supernatural authority, you know, very key. I said that. All key everywhere in Congo today. You know, chiefs, everyone has to have supernatural authority. Mobutu tried to wield kind of project supernatural authority. Absence of taxation and public good provision. So, you know, from a sort of Western perspective, we look at Congo and we say, oh gosh, you know, why don't they tax more? You know, shouldn't there be more public good provision? Yeah, probably, but the historical social contract all over Africa rarely involved taxation or the type of public good provision that we expect in Western society. So Mobutu did do that, but that really wasn't part of his social imaginary, I would say, because that's not how kind of states operated in Central Africa. The absence of the monopoly of violence, I kind of tried to motivate, well, that's actually quite a normal thing in this way of building a state, and an ungoverned, you know, ungoverned periphery, in the sense that political sovereignty in Kinshasa did not extend, you know, to the periphery. You know, that's the segmentary structure. Okay, I won't talk about how complicated Mobutu's problem was, and, you know, I won't talk about that either. You know, and, you know, let me push more on this. The leopard skin hat. You know, the leopard skin hat. You think that's cool? Mobutu always wore this leopard skin hat. Why did he wear a leopard skin hat? That's a chief. The chief leopard. The leopard. Here's some Vancino. You know, the leopard is deeply associated with power. You know, right the way back into Proto-Bantu, the origins of the modern Bantu languages. The leopard is thoroughly identified with political leadership. He was evoking a very traditional notion of power and authority. Praise songs. You know, this is something from Turner and Young's book on two political scientists who wrote a kind of very prominent book on Mobutu's state. They kind of make fun of the fact that this is a jalelo, it's a praise song, you know, like tapping into the culture of power, I say. You know, the country is called Zaire, Shaba is nothing more than the work of Mobutu, you know, so it's sort of praising President Mobutu. I want to say, this is nothing odd about this. This is just the way things are in Africa. This is how power is legitimized, power is projected. You know, people are praised. Everybody's praised. Even in Botswana, you know, so, you know, there's nothing odd about this in Congo. In Botswana, all the chiefs have praise names, you know, praise poems. Here's a praise poem, I won't read it out, of Shikedi Kama. So Botswana is interesting because, you know, Botswana is the most functional country probably in Africa. It's been perpetually democratic since independence. It's been the most successful economy since independence in 1965. But Swana chiefs have praise poems too, just like Mobutu, talking about, the lion roared at Wanda at Shikedi, who saw it, the chief challenging it, everybody else ran, the wind pierced the young men's bones, but not Shikedi. So, and praise poems are a lot more complicated, and it ends by saying, give us rain. Rainmaking is a big thing in Botswana too. Pula is the name of the currency, and that means rain in Setswana. It's also a greeting, Pula. If I say to you, Pula, rain, that's like a greeting. So rainmaking, same kind of thing. And, it turns out there's a lot more to praise poems than praise also. Praise poems are actually a traditional mechanism of criticizing authority. So, and if you go today in Kinshasa, here's Prime Minister Matata. I was at an event with Prime Minister Matata 3 years ago in Kinshasa. Mr. Matata comes with his praise singers. The guy with the megaphone, he's singing the praises of the Prime Minister Matata. Here's his guys on the right, so this is not something odd. It's a very traditional model of legitimate political authority. Okay, and that's what Mobutu did. He had supernatural powers, or at least he claimed to have supernatural powers. He resolved disputes. He didn't provide a lot of public goods. Just like the Alor chiefs and like many of these other segmentary estates too. President Mobutu, of course, if you know his name, you're probably thinking of high corruption, castles in Morocco and all this money he stole. Sure. There were very few mechanisms of accountability in this new thing called the Congolese state. There were mineral wealth. There were all sorts of things which are outside the scope of a traditional social contract, and there were not mechanisms to control it. So, yes, this model didn't work very well. I'm not saying it worked very well or did a good job of providing services or anything for the Congolese people. It ended up, crashing with a lot of instability. But of course, it wasn't adapted to the challenges of a modern state. All I'm saying is that it was a logical thing that Mobutu understood to try to attempt. Okay, and that's true with many of these models in post-colonial Africa. It's true in Sierra Leone. That model of how to run the economy kind of crashed in the Sierra Leone Civil War. It was true under Nkrumah, these attempts to create socialism and tap into kind of African sort of ideas about African communalism. So none of these models work very well, but they were genuinely indigenous attempts to kind of construct a legitimate state after the colonizers, packed their bags and left. So I think, for me, the real blame is not the Africans, it's the Europeans that created this incredibly complicated political challenges for these post-independence leaders. Okay, here's just something fun on supernatural power. If this is the lyrics from a very famous song in Congo by Franco, who was a great Congolese Rumba artist, very famous Congolese musician, who wrote a song called Mobutu. And if you read the lyrics, you can listen to it on YouTube. The lyrics, it's all about the sorcerers. Our candidate is Mobutu. Central Committee, watch out for sorcerers. Their provocations have not stopped. Mobutu, the sorcerers are still here. So he's kind of evoking, that we need the chief, Mobutu, to have supernatural power. Why? Because there's witchcraft, there's sorcerers, and bandoki, and we need to. How do you combat witchcraft? Well, you need chiefs, leaders with supernatural power this is real, and I think you have to understand this to understand the kind of architecture of the Congolese state and why it doesn't do the sorts of things that we think a state should do. So this is my last slide, and so I think, this is, one could talk about all sorts of mechanisms in the East. We can talk about natural resource growth, we can talk about conflict over land, the huge negative fallout from the Rwandan genocide and this great Congo war. But my argument is, you have to see this in the context of a kind of deeper dynamics of the construction of political order in post-colonial Africa. When I look at that, I see many echoes of pre-colonial political structures, pre-colonial political legitimacy. Those things have been reinvented, of course, and reimagined, in this new context. But many of the logics, in my own personal experience, are kind of still at play. And that's why, you have this relationship, which seems so curious from a European perspective, between the center and the periphery, why you don't have a monopoly of violence, why the Congo has so many problems in terms of building, a kind of modern state that we would think of. Okay, yeah, this is about the abuse of power and corruption in the center, but it's also about Congolese people's views about what constitutes legitimate authority, and I think we need to understand that much better than we do. Okay, so I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to take you up on your last slide, can you help us understand better whether these dynamics are something that are of a different nature for the Congolese state as compared to other states in Africa? Because to some extent, the protracted nature of the violence that we've seen there seems somewhat unique. And so would you say that it's a conjunction of different factors that have created this, or in the history itself, Congo differs from some other countries that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I think, to give you one example of the persistence of this model, this is sort of exactly how Paul Biya runs the Cameroon. That model is still operating in parts of Africa. So why isn't there chaos in the Cameroon? Well, there's a fair bit of chaos in the Cameroon, but I agree it's not on this scale. I think it's because this was just a uniquely difficult problem. The Congo is just so large, compared to any other country in Africa, and it's so diverse and heterogeneous that the scale of it was just much larger. The scale of it was much larger, and it's of course that. But this goes back, back into the 1960s. There were all of these rebellions in the east, in the south. So there's been persistent conflict for a long time. Maybe it doesn't look in the 1960s like it does now, with all this incredibly fragmented, political geography of all these different armed groups. But I would say, the most obvious explanation is that it's just this model is much hard. It's just that the bigger and bigger the scale, the more and more difficult it is to organize this thing, and that really accounts for why it sort of malfunctioned so badly in the DRC relative to other places, Gabon or Cameroon in some sense, where it's still an operational and it's being kind of more stable. But on the other hand, you could say Mobutu was in power for 32 years, so how, from his perspective, it was quite a successful model.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. In fact, the sheer size of the country makes it extremely hard, even for the most efficient and functional state, to control what's going on, let alone for a state with the history of Congo. Now let's ask Raul to join us now. And Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, our second speaker, is an assistant professor at University of Chicago. Previously, he taught at UC Berkeley, and he's the co-founder of the Maracuja Kivu Research. So Raul made a brave choice when he was a grad student between 2009 and 2014. That was to spend a long time, a good part of his PhD, in the field in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and in somewhat dangerous circumstances, as he spent time with rebel groups to study them and understand them better. And he has written extremely important work on the origins of the state and informal taxation in the Congo, which is part of what he will talk to us about today. So Raul, thank you for joining us, and please help us understand these rebel groups better.
Perfect. Thank you for the generous introduction. Now you should see the full slides. Okay, so in the first presentation, Professor Robinson helped us placing the Congolese state back into its historical and cultural context. Perhaps what I'm going to do is a slightly opposite direction, which is looking outside the Congolese state and trying to show even from the very narrow Western perspective of what a state is, that outside the state we encounter very similar logics among armed groups. And so I'm going to start with one example. The example is one of the largest armed groups today in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's the Nduma Defense of Congo Renewed, whose General Guido is in the image. The official mission of the Nduma Defense of Congo is to provide security in a district called Walikale in North Kivu, to eradicate negative armed forces, specifically for the case of the Nduma Defense of Congo. This is a group, an enemy group called the FDLR that has ties to Rwanda and that has been perpetrating a lot of violence against the population in Walikale. And so it's one of the reasons the Nduma Defense of Congo emerged in 2008. And then a variety of motives that they call political recognition that have to do with bargaining with the central government for some concessions towards the people of Walikale, but also towards the high-ranked officers of the Nduma Defense of Congo. So what do they do to achieve those objectives, even though they may also have sometimes different objectives? They spend a lot of effort in war-making, offensive military operations against these enemies, but also state-making, and specifically once they push away the enemy armed groups, the FDLR or other groups, they spend a lot of effort on defensive military operations to protect the territory. They spend a lot of effort in eliminating internal enemies that may threaten the stability of their territorial control. So they have created a police agency in 2011, and they spent a lot of effort also in every village protecting 124 villages in the territory, which is approximately the area of Lombardy. Now, to make those operations possible, they need to finance. They need money to finance those. So they collect taxes from 4,000 to 5,000 adults, approximately. One of the forms of the taxes they collect is called the poll tax or capitation tax, which is a very common form of taxation in the European state formation process prior to the development of the income tax, when income became possible to observe. Now, to do these operations, in fact, they need much more than just poll tax. So they need human resources, and they have about 2,000 recruits. Interestingly, the operations are led by rank and file soldiers. There's about 1,000 of them. But to manage those, there's a lot of human resources that are in the background. So these are high-ranked officers and bureaucrats to manage these operations. So a lot of effort is spent in the bureaucracy and organization of those operations. And to obtain a constant flow of recruits, they have a human resource agency. This is the number of recruits that they obtain every month in the last couple of years. So every month, approximately 30 individuals join the recruits. In green is from their administrative records, and in blue is actually a verification system that we put in place where all of the human resource managers of the group call us whenever there is a new recruit. So this is quite reliable data, as it turns out. But they also need not just human resources, they need intelligence. So they have an intelligence agency that obtains information from the enemy as well as from inside their territory. They need logistics, procurement, and equipment to conduct those operations. So they have a large number of spares, machetes, guns, grenades, satellite phones to communicate in the area. And importantly, to govern the territory, they need people to pay taxes, they need people to comply to the rule, and they need people who join hopefully voluntarily and who are motivated with the mission of the group. So they also have an agency for the relationship with civilians that is in charge of nurturing the legitimacy of the group's objective in the territory they govern, but also to promote a constant flow of recruits. Here is one of those campaigns that the agency organizes in the villages. In this image, you see the former general called Sheka with the amulets of the Nyanga people, who are the dominant group in Walikale, and these amulets, just as in the example of Mobutu in the previous presentation, are associated with power. In this campaign, they had just taken one village and they were presenting the objectives of the group to the population. And in the days that followed, a significant number of recruits joined the group voluntarily after having listened to the ideology of the group. Often the messages that are sent here are about the absence of the Congolese state, the absence of the United Nations, or other self-defense militia groups to protect the population from the atrocities the FDLR. So these are the number of campaigns, for instance, that they do every month. About 10 to 20 is the number of those campaigns. Those campaigns tend to be associated with recruitment. So this is the spatial distribution and intensity of those campaigns in pink. And in those campaigns, you also see, in the places where those campaigns take place, an influx of recruits, typically following those campaigns as well. Now, all of these has costs. And so in January 2001 alone, to pay the wages of the staff costed about $200,000, most of which went, in fact, to the wages of the officers and the bureaucracy to support the operations, but also food ration, social assistance to the staff, medical supplies, as well as transport costs between the city of Goma and Walikale. And a large share of the costs are also purchases of supplies of beer, liquors, and cigarettes, which they use partly. One of the reasons they use those is to sell them in the territory. So they have the monopoly of the sale of those objects. So the total cost of operating the organization is about $500,000 every month. So how do they finance this? Well, sometimes they receive support from neighboring countries or from governments, but in general, the most stable source of revenue is taxation. The one tax that I mentioned is the poll tax or capitation tax, which is $1 per adult per month, but also there are in-kind taxes for different activities, hunters, beer retailers, miners, hunters and gatherers, licenses for operating. One of the most significant sources of revenues are the license for miners to operate. They also have value-added tax, which they call, which my understanding is rather an import tariff. So every trader that comes into the territory must pay 10% of the merchandise value, and they use the intelligence agency to deploy observers to every point of entry into the territory to make sure that all the traders pay their tax, as well as weekly mining output taxes depending on the minerals. They also have these monopolies for the sale of goods, which is the second source of revenue for the group itself. The total revenue is approximately, in the month of January alone, $2 million. It tends to be relatively stable in the last couple of years, although it tended to be lower than this. The balance in their administrative documents that they have, it appears that they would have $18 million in cash. That this is the one number that I couldn't verify, but it's quite a large number. So these are the tokens they use to collect poll taxes. Every household gets one of those tokens whenever they pay the poll tax, and then they come and verify how many households have the taxes. And this is just a snapshot of the different sources of income for the group over a short period. But you see in blue, dark blue, is the authorization tax from miners, faiseurs in French, the license for operating, as well as the revenues from distributing cigarettes into the area, as well as authorization tax for gatherers being the main sources of revenue of the group. So these basic functions require, as I hinted, a more sophisticated organization. And so they have their Bureau 1, which is in charge of human resources, is also in charge of the fiscal administration of the group. And this was one of their early documents in 2015, where they list the censuses that they conduct in every village, as well as the number of tax tokens that they distribute, as well as they try to track the production of minerals to then tax it. And so that's their organigram. This is a typical organigram for conventional armies with Bureau 1 to 5. But the one difference is that Bureau 1 is typically in charge of staff and HR in this case, because the functions that they perform are a bit more sophisticated than just war making, but also include state making. They also are in charge of the entire fiscal administration of the group. There's also Bureau 6 in charge of religious affairs, and they are in charge of coordinating the traditional healers, or what some people may call witch doctors in the area that provide support and legitimacy to the group. Now, this group is just one of many different groups in the area. This is a map from Kivu Security Tracker in October 2020 that shows the area of North Kivu. This pink area is the Nduma Defense of Congo, but there's also many other different groups. In South Kivu, just to the south, you see even more groups. They tend to be perhaps less organized and larger in number, or at least more split. The dynamics of conflict are a bit different. This is Tanganyika further to the south and Ituri to the north. So there's a lot of these groups. And you see from the example that one of them, the Nduma Defensive Congo, which is one of the most sophisticated ones, performs very much what one would consider state functions. And so one natural question to ask is when do armed actors provide state functions? And I want to suggest two different types of functions to focus on. One is the most basic state functions, or simply protection rackets. So whether they hold a monopoly of violence, whether they tax, and whether they provide protection. There's almost, this is what economists may call the extensive margin of state formation. Less than this, there's almost nothing that looks like state functions. That would be the first step of the process, and perhaps more advanced state functions may include administration, fiscal administration, justice administration, and perhaps more sophisticated types of taxes than the most basic type of tax, which could be a tax on output, for instance, on production. So I want to show you the result of a now old study that provides a very economicist explanation. There's many reasons, many answers to this question, but it attempts to show that the extent to which armed groups can expect to obtain revenues from taxation can be an important explanatory factor in whether they developed some of these state functions. So the study looked at North and South Kivu. In one aspect that's relevant and that a lot of external observers are aware of is that this area also has natural resources. So in gold, you see places that have gold, and in red, you see places that have a mineral called columbite tantalite, which is also called coltan in the case of the Congo, and in purple, you have other types of resources. The role of natural resources for conflict is often very much exaggerated by the news, but given that they are in this setting, they can be used to infer how armed groups respond to economic trade-offs. So it's not necessarily about natural resources, but they have an influence in ways that are perhaps more deep than we tend to think from the news. And so what are these minerals? Here's one of those minerals, coltan, which is characteristic in that output is bulky, in the sense that it's easy to find, and if someone were to want to hide whatever they find, it would be relatively worthless. So typically, you see people carrying large amounts of coltan. These are the transporters who take coltan from the mining sites to places where it can be shipped. As a result of it being easy to observe, but also vulnerable perhaps to attacks, you tend to see the emergence of armed actors, which you barely see here, but there's one of them at the back, who provide protection on those routes and also tax the production of coltan as a function of the quantity. So it's a very simple form of creating a monopoly of violence in an area, taxing the output and protecting to ensure that taxation can remain in the future. Now, in contrast to coltan, gold, the other mineral that is also relevant in that area, is not so bulky, and it's very profitable to hide small amounts of gold. It's also difficult to find. So as a result, the people who work in the artisanal sector of gold tend to either swallow gold or hide gold and then go further away and sell it in different places. And so that makes it much more difficult for armed groups when you talk to them to create system of taxation just in the places where gold is mined. It depends on the types of mining, but most of the time it's difficult. And so as a result, armed actors tend to focus their state functions, if you want, in places where miners and their families live, where money is in circulation from gold, but that tends to be places that are not the places where gold is mined itself, but rather villages and towns in the nearby areas, where they try to tax either consumption, population movement, and develop administrations to try to track those. So in this setting, it turns out that there were drastic changes in the prices of minerals. Here's the price of coltan. In the year 2000, there was a shock in that price following PlayStation 2 going on the market. And the price of gold also has another price shock following the 9/11 and the global recession. So these price shocks can be used to illustrate how armed groups' strategies to build state functions may respond to whether output is there that can be easy to tax. And so just to give you a sense of the results, there were two questions. When do basic functions emerge? One answer, among many others, is when the value of what is produced, and in this case coltan, is large, and when it's easy to tax such output, then you tend to see the emergence of customs taxation systems where people tax just the output, provide protection in the areas where it's produced, the independent effect of those basic functions on households, as it turns out, just purely from statistical analysis, is that households tend to have larger amount of assets, tend to have better indicators of wealth when those state functions are deployed, but only if the armed actors are locals. And locals encompasses many different groups, but they tend to be Congolese militia, whereas so-called foreigner armed groups, which have ties to other groups, do not have a positive impact on household welfare. So there's a nuance when we think of state functions. Typically, state functions historically emerge when an elite is trying to extract resources from the population that tend to coexist with perhaps prosperity, but for the elite only. And in this case, this prosperity appears to be redistributed to the population when the armed actors are Congolese militia. When do advanced functions emerge? Well, in the case of Coltan, not many advanced functions are needed. It's very simple to track customs. What you see is that when local GDP in circulation, local economic activity in circulation is large, but taxing output is difficult. So as in the case of gold, when the price of gold goes up, you tend to see the emergence of fiscal administration, justice administrations, and more sophisticated forms of taxation in the places where the families of the miners live. And so these include poll taxes, transit taxes, taxes on the local markets, and other taxes. So this is one economicist explanation that allows to show that this is one of the causes, at least, of why these functions emerge, and it attempts to rationalize these actions from the lens of this very narrow Western view of the state, as saying that very similar logics are at place even outside the state that's recognized in the international state system. Now, this perhaps Western-centric approach ignores the cultural context and historical context from where those armed actors emerge, and specifically, these are the Nduma Defense of Congo administrators. Next to them is one of the most recent traditional chiefs or customary chiefs that were enthroned by the Nyanga people. The traditional chiefs are also recognized by the Congolese state. So what's the relationship between these two different forms of power? Just like in the European context, just as in recent and African history, armed actors who try to govern need to operate with the traditional chiefs, because these are those who embed the custom and the forms of legitimacy in the area. And so when you talk to the NDC administrators, they would tell you that these are our chiefs, they are the legitimate authority of our Nyanga people. We cannot just replace them. That would be an absurd idea. So we had to work with them, and we could not go against them because that would be violating our customs, enraging our ancestors and our people. We would go against the very success of the NDC. So they developed the taxation systems working through the chiefs, but also they respected the chiefs as the legitimate political authority in the villages. The chiefs are not necessarily treated well. That depends on the power that they have vis-a-vis with armed groups. But they always have to be taken into account one way or another, especially when the groups control large territory, when the people they govern tend to be further and further apart from the leaders. And so using similar data, one of the things that appears is that a lot of the armed groups in the area, which includes Congolese militia called Mai Mai, or former groups called RCD, or other Congolese militia, all of them tend to govern either through indirect rule, that is through the local elites, the chiefs, or sharing power with the chiefs, or replacing the chief directly. And so we find that the reasons for why they work with chiefs or they replace the chief vary. Some groups have a very different style. For instance, the FDLR has a much more state-like approach and tends to replace all institutions, and they view it as building the institutions of a state, basically. But many others vary in their attempts. And so they tend to do so when the population they govern is different from them culturally, so they need the traditional authority as an intermediary for the rule. But also one of the things that we see is that this is the years since the start of each armed group episode of governance in a village, they all tend, no matter how they start, they all tend to converge towards replacing traditional authorities and going more towards systems of direct rule. And so the way we measure this is whether the chief taxes, whether the chief recruits, who has political power, and a variety of different actions related to power. Over years of governance, they always tend to converge towards replacing the chief, even though many of them start governing with the chiefs. So that's just a little nuance that I wanted to bring. And finally, to conclude, I wanted to take a step back and from the perspective of outsiders, then fine, there are all these armed groups and they perform state functions, but what's the response of the Congolese state or the United Nations? Well, one common response, in addition to integration, which was mentioned in the previous presentation, is to have military operations to remove those groups and replace them with state control. Now, the problem, as I suggested, is that those groups perform state functions, and so attempts to dismantle those groups could disrupt the underlying forces that may discipline the extent to which they use arbitrary violence, or instead use violence less, expropriate people less, and create systems of taxation and protection. Now, even if those systems may asphyxiate the population, they are certainly asphyxiate them less than if they perform arbitrary violence. And so one question is, can those military operations disrupt these state functions equilibria? And the answer is yes. And so here is, I'm just going to show you the effect of one of those operations called Kenya 2 that took place in 2009 and targeted mostly the area of Brazil in the district of Mwenga. Brazil was controlled almost only by the FDLR in 2008. Kenya 2 was a military operation by the Congolese army that targeted a large number of villages, but especially Brazil. And what you see as a result of the operation is the Congolese army takes control over the areas that were controlled by the FDLR, which we call the FDLR state. The FDLR is removed, the taxes and taxation revenues drops to almost zero, and none of this happens outside the so-called FDLR state in Brazil. But what happens is that in the FDLR state, the fraction of villages that were subject to violent pillages by the FDLR, and these are quite traumatic episodes of violence, skyrockets. But it doesn't skyrocket by other actors. It's just the FDLR who starts targeting the villages they formerly protected. That doesn't happen outside the FDLR state. And so there's a number of reasons why that can occur. Maybe it's retaliation against households or unpaid debts or a nationwide strategy to weaken the government. But we find evidence in the data that the reason this is happening is that when they were taxing, one of the reasons they were providing protection and not arbitrarily expropriating households through villages is that they expected to expropriate in the future, tomorrow, through a system of taxation. And so these military operations remove the expectation of being able to tax in the future or a long time horizon of stealing, and therefore unraveled this restraining of violence that they used to do before the operation into making optimal to simply systematically pillage. Now, there's also a lot of qualitative evidence suggesting that other reasons may be at play, but the data seems to suggest that a simple economicist explanation in terms of taxation disciplines expropriation is important. And so that's the conclusion. Just there's many different ways to understand the logic of armed groups. The most famous one from the news is greed and natural resources or ethnic conflicts, and these are by far not the dominant explanation. There's self-defense motives, ideology, and even national sovereignty. And I just argued that one of the useful way to think about them is as states in the making, because of their needs to be financed, whatever their objective is, and whatever their duration is. And one important aspect is that the need to frequently expropriate the population in the future creates relationships of dependency that are two-sided with nuanced implications, just as in the effect of the military operation. When they start needing the population, which is something that political scientists call stationary bandits, they begin to internalize certain aspects of certain costs that arbitrary expropriations and violence generate on the population, because it affects their future ability to tax, even if they may also care about the population. And so this account was just extremely simplistic and ignores the history of armed mobilizations in the region. You have, for instance, among the Nyanga in 1906 was one of the first recorded rebellions against colonizers, and all of this is just part of a long continuum that I didn't talk about. But the one way in which I hope to have pointed at this context that Professor Robinson was mentioning in the first lecture is that these state functions are actually embedded in complex relationships with traditional modes of government which have existed from the past, but also with the Congolese state of today. And so I'll just close here with a variety of small pieces of evidence. I hope to have provided suggestive evidence that state functions are a useful way to think about those groups. And this is just some of the work I used in this presentation.
Thank you, Raul. This was quite striking. I must say, realizing when you said the cost of operations is like $500,000 per month, I thought, whoa, that's a lot. I wonder how much they're going to make to cover these costs. And then it turns out that revenues are $2 million. So that's a pretty lucrative operation, and we understand why it may be so hard to dismantle. Now, one of the things you highlighted is that because they are now in this equilibrium where they've learned to work in a repeated way with the local population, military operations might backfire in the short run. But then I wanted to ask you, what do you see as a path forward? Are you thinking that eventually these rebel organizations will be absorbed by the state through some process? What could be a way out of this local rule by many rebel groups, in your opinion?
So one strategy that has been tried in the past, that's an alternative to military efforts, is recognizing that a lot of these groups have sufficient military power that it would be very costly for the state and for the population to try to dismantle. There's an important nuance between those groups that are of foreign origin, like the FDLR, and groups that are perhaps more like social movements, like the Congolese militia. And there's a lot of very different ones. But one strategy that was used in the past, in 2003, 2004, was to integrate some of those groups into the forces of the state, and then attempt to redeploy them in different areas. Integration also was attempted as part of bargaining deals with groups that have ties with foreign countries. And so this, I think, is an interesting avenue for thinking about stability in the region. There are two implications from that strategy that are useful to highlight. One is by bargaining to bring in people that had networks with foreign countries or with loyalties that were not perhaps with the Congolese state. What this created is the subsequent series of mutinies and new groups that then threatened the state. It also created, for instance, in the origin of the Nduma defense of Congo in 2008, one of the reasons they were successful is because they reached out to military networks of the Congolese state that had alliances with Rwanda and that were based in Goma at the time. And these military networks, who were Tutsi, had an interest in removing the FDLR. So they, under the cover of the Congolese state, they also provided logistical and financial support to the creation of the Nduma defense of Congo. So one drawback of that is that it's depending on who the state brings, it's bringing a set of networks with different loyalties that can contribute to undermining the sovereignty of the state. The one caution is how to think about what are the networks that are being brought in. But the other that I think is quite fascinating is that when all of these groups were brought into the state in 2004, this sent a signal. In a static sense, it appears to be the best solution, but it also sent a signal that if one was able to create an armed group, one would be able to have this political recognition as a request. And therefore, a lot of groups began to emerge who expected to use their power to integrate the forces. So in a dynamic sense, it also incentivizes the creation of groups. And the most talented entrepreneurs tend to go into this setting in Eastern DRC. So I think integration is a very interesting way to solve that problem, mindful with the challenges that it may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let's move to the last part of this discussion. And let me introduce Judith Verweijen, our last speaker, who's a lecturer in international relations in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Sheffield. Judith is an expert on militarization, and she has studied the dynamics of violence in this part of Africa. In particular, she's been committed to doing fieldwork in the DRC since 2010. So differently from the talks that we've seen in the first part by Jim Robinson and Raul Sanchez, Judith is now going to trace the links between the state, the rebel groups, and potentially economic interests in the area of Eastern DRC, telling us about the role of minerals and natural resources, among other things. So thank you, Judith, for agreeing to take part in this discussion, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Yes, let me share my presentation. I'm not really seeing how that works at this stage. Hold on. Not sure what happened there. Sorry, bear with me for a moment. Oh, full screen, yes. So indeed, I'm going to talk about the conflict in the Congo. And I'm going to basically sketch out a perspective through which to view this conflict. So there has been violence going on for over 2 decades now in a more or less cyclical manner. And the question is, how are we making sense of that violence? So often we look at a situation of ongoing violence as one of violent conflict, in which we have a relatively limited number of well-delineated conflict parties, and in which we have relatively well-delineated and stable projects and grievances. And so we often tend to think of violent conflict as a situation that is about something. It's about like 2 ethnic groups in conflict, or it's about the secessionist aspirations of a particular nation without a state, etc. And we tend to link that to the idea of root causes, leading to a relatively clear narrative of what a war is about, right? The war is about certain grievances, or it is about a power struggle, etc. Now, against this, I want to sort of oppose the perspective of what I label militarization. And with that, I mean the dominance of armed actors, both state and non-state forces, in spheres of life that we would normally consider civilian. For instance, the economy, political life, but also social life. So a process of militarization is something where you see actually armed actors being dominant as governors in those civilian spheres of life. And it is my argument that situations of protracted violent conflict generate a process of militarization that becomes almost self-enforcing, because people adopt strategies to hedge against insecurity and to be able to generate income that end up reinforcing the position of armed groups. And therefore, insecurity breeds further insecurity. So we end up in a situation that we're becoming detached to a certain extent from like original root causes, and have to more analyze a militarized social system and what the incentive structures are that this system creates, which cause a further reproduction of that system. And in doing that, I'm going to also shed some light on different levels of interest. So one of the particular features of violent conflict in the Congo is that it's multi-layered. We don't identify drivers only at the level of like local conflicts or national power struggles, or regional conflict within the Great Lakes region linked to geopolitical interest, or at the international level. It's all these levels that sort of intersect. But as I will explain, this is not simply linked to economic interests understood in a narrow sense. As Raul already pointed out, the conflict in Congo, because it is so complex, and again, I put one of these maps here which depicts the large number of armed groups that we see in Eastern Congo today. It's like over 140 groups of all shapes and sizes, which defies like a simple explanation for conflict. Nevertheless, we sometimes hear it is about minerals plunder by like international business interests, or we sometimes hear other narratives, monocausal narratives, saying it's linked to like ethnic conflict, etc. And so to debunk some of these more simplistic narratives, I want to sketch out a bit of a more complex picture of what the drivers of this violence are. Now, if we look at the level of international business interests, specifically of multinational corporations, we see that there is in fact surprisingly limited direct investment and direct presence of transnational corporations in East Congo. There are a number of industrial mining companies that set up shop there, but their operations, at least of some of them, have been very importantly actually undermined by the violence rather than that they benefited from it. And here I refer notably to the example of the Canadian gold mining corporation Benro, which actually had to close down, or which actually decided to sell two of its operations after repeated attacks by armed groups. What we see is that the direct big business interests are actually in the mining of copper and cobalt in southeast Congo. And to build like industrial mines, you need a certain amount of stability, high levels of electricity, and a very volatile environment actually is not very beneficial to such operations. What we also see is there has been conflict minerals regulation systems, for instance, to tag and trace minerals that have been developed in response to this narrative of there being conflict minerals, but that has actually made sourcing from the DRC more complicated. So what we do see, international companies, in particular electronics producers, do buy minerals from the Congo, but only like later down the chain. It's only after those minerals that are being exported to different African countries go to smelters and refiners, which are often based in Asia, and produce then components that it actually ends up with multinational corporations. So we therefore also see that there does seem to be limited direct economic interests by multinational corporations in instability in Eastern Congo at the moment. I think the conflict minerals narrative very strongly originates in the Second Congo War, and Raul already showed this massive boom in coltan prices in the year 2000. And that was when those interests were a bit more directly linked, but as the situation evolved over time, the interests are more indirect, I would say. If we look at other economic stakes, we could maybe point to the international peacekeeping and peace-building industry, which is also an important sector of the economy. And of course, that sector has an indirect interest in instability in order to maintain its own presence and justify its activities. But again, this is a quite indirect relation. So the second level I want to look at is the regional level of the Great Lakes region. As Raul already pointed out, there are numerous foreign armed groups that are active in Eastern Congo. And what we also observe is the direct entry of armed forces from neighboring countries conducting military operations on Congolese soil. Now, today, this doesn't assume the same proportions as it did during the Second Congo War, when the Rwandan army and the Ugandan army were actually had a very active presence in Eastern DRC and even occupied certain parts and were closely allied to particular Congolese rebel groups. What we witness today is a very complex situation that I label as a sort of militarization of regional geopolitics. And at the heart of this are tensions between Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. There's limited direct confrontation between these forces, but we could label this a proxy war, in which, for instance, Burundi supports armed groups that are fighting against Kigali, and Kigali supports some armed groups that are fighting against Bujumbura, Burundi. So it's really the enemy of the enemy is my friend type of proxy logic that we see there. And this has, of course, important repercussions for dynamics of conflict and violence because it explains why there are foreign rebel groups active in Eastern Congo. And it really does add to the volatility. Now, why is this the case? We have to understand that a lot of these regimes in the region, including that in Burundi, but also in Uganda and Rwanda, are post-liberation regimes. These are former political military movements that at some point gained power and then transformed into political parties and have been dominating the government of those countries for many years now, many decades in fact. So somewhere the sort of, the logic that military force is an ultimate reassurance has remained within the fabric of those post-liberation regimes. What we also see, another reason, is there are interwoven political military elite networks, often forged during the Congo Wars, that link certain current rebel groups to political, military, governmental elites in neighboring countries. That complex dynamic also ensures that there is interventions in a military sense. Again, when we look at the economic interest, it is true that during the Second Congo War, there was an important amount of what we could call resource plunder by both Rwanda and Uganda. Now, today, the economies of both these countries have diversified, and the smuggling of minerals is still an important part, I would say, also of certain agricultural products of these economies, in particular in Uganda and Rwanda. The picture is a bit unclear, but it is quite unclear to what extent this ongoing chaotic situation of ongoing violence with more than like 140 rebel groups directly benefits this. Smuggling of minerals, etc., really emerged in the Mobutu era when the informal economy blossomed in response to the near total collapse of the formal economy, and that was before we actually saw violence. What you need for smuggling is weak government, is limited state control at the borders, but not necessarily a lot of violence. So again, I think I can't make a very direct link between the economic interests of the neighboring countries and the ongoing situation of violence. We have to see this in nuanced terms. Now, coming to Kinshasa, and this relates a bit back to what James talked about earlier. To what extent does Kinshasa have an interest, a direct interest, or are its interests harmed by the conflict in Eastern DRC? What we've seen is that the presidential circle, because in the Congo, power is really concentrated in the presidential circle rather than in the government that emerges through elections. It tends to be not very threatened by instability in the East, but it also doesn't directly depend on it financially. Now, for the previous government that under Joseph Kabila, its main sources of income actually came from industrial mining in the southeast, so not in Kivu. Certain businesses in Kinshasa, including in construction, cement, as well as oil in Congo Central. So that actually means that the government or the presidential circle doesn't really directly benefit economically from the ongoing violence in the East. It has different economic bases. It also has overall quite limited incentive.
Judith, I think we lost you. Maybe your mic went off.
Oh, hold on. I don't think so.
Now we hear you again.
All right, great. Good, I'm happy. Maybe there was a glitch in the connection, that's possible. So the armed forces of the DRC are relatively vast. There's like on paper a manpower of like over 150,000 troops. And state revenues are limited. Now, the army in the Congo is in part self-financed, whether it concerns rank and file soldiers or very highly ranked officers of the army. Everyone is implicated in various types of revenue generation. That includes taxation, that includes running different types of businesses in real estate, or even at a very small scale, small scale trade in cigarettes. So the ongoing insecurity in the East does allow the military to generate a lot of revenues because they set up checkpoints, etc. And to a certain extent that allows the army to be in part self-financed. We also see that a number of higher placed officers benefit a lot from, in particular, natural resources extraction, taxing around mining sites. They often trade in certain minerals. They're implicated in the production and trade of charcoal, as well as illegal fishing. And that also helps to actually buy the loyalty from these higher placed officers, because they're allowed to make a fair amount of revenues through the insecurity in the East. Now, what is interesting is that recently there was a state of siege that was declared by the current president, Felix Tshisekedi. And that actually does seem to be a move to reinforce his political grip over both the armed forces as well as the political scene in the East. So what we currently witness is a bit more interest by Kinshasa to maybe stem or at least keep the insecurity within particular manageable bounds of which the presidential power circle can set the parameters. If I talk about militarization, I talked about militarization at different levels, ranging from the local level to the regional level, but also in different dimensions, both politically and economically. And I will now talk about both these dimensions. Politically, we see that national and provincial politicians, so members of parliament as well as ministers, often support armed groups in the East, notably those armed groups that operate in their zones of origin. So politics in Congo remains to a large extent, or it plays out along regional lines, but also along ethnic lines. So people vote for politicians that come from their area of origin. And these politicians often have incentives to support armed groups that operate in their zone of origins. Why? A lot of armed groups operate with discourses of self-defense. And that is because there's a fair amount of inter-community conflicts where one group sees that they are threatened by another. And therefore, supporting an armed group that claims to defend the community earns a politician a certain amount of popular support. There's also another reason. If you support an armed group, it means you have leverage over that armed group. You can influence maybe, whether they commit violence, and you may also be able to ultimately convince them to lay down their arms. So supporting an armed group gives politicians a certain amount of influence. They use that influence in order to gain political influence at the national level, because they become the government in Kinshasa often doesn't directly control areas in the East, but they control it through intermediaries who have influence there. And so being able to control an armed group really sort of enhances the negotiating position of individual politicians versus the presidential power circle in Kinshasa, and that can ultimately earn them important political positions. And finally, there's also the protection of business interests that plays a role here. Now, local governance, so the level of customary chiefs and local administrators, there we also see a decent amount of militarization. Local authorities also liaise with armed groups and also particular army units. Why? It backs up their authority. It helps them to enforce decisions. It also gives them an edge over competitors. Why is this important? We see a lot of conflict around local authority and local governance in the Congo. There are succession conflicts between customary chiefs. There are also conflicts around the boundaries of local governance entities. And in all these conflicts, it becomes very enticing for one of the conflict parties to solicit the support from an armed group or an army faction in order to back up their position. And here at the level of local authorities also revenue generation schemes play again a role. Like customary chiefs also operate certain business activities and taxation, and being backed up by an armed group can facilitate the implementation of those schemes. Now to come to the economic level, and this has already been discussed in great detail by Raul. That's the implication of armed groups in different forms of taxation, but also business operations and extraction. And here I add that it's also the Congolese national armed forces that engage in these revenue generation schemes. Now that is a direct form of implication of armed actors in the economy. What I would like to emphasize here is the indirect involvement through what we call protection arrangements. There are lots of illegal revenue generation activities in Eastern Congo, ranging from illegal fishing to banditry to like the trade in cannabis. Now, engaging in these activities is risky because you can be busted by the authorities as they are technically illegal. So what happens, different armed groups as well as the armed forces protect these illegal revenue generation activities in exchange for protection fees. So what we see happening, for instance, at Lake Edward is people go fishing in zones where it is forbidden, and they pay to like a particular Mai Mai group in order to go fishing there. So the Mai Mai protect this type of illegal activity. And this is a situation that we see in really many different illegal economic sectors. And that means that a vast amount of people depend for their livelihoods on the protection of armed groups or army units. And this is also a way in which armed groups are actually socially embedded in Eastern Congo. And we shouldn't forget here that the Congo is, of course, a very poor country. And so many people just depend for their livelihoods directly on these protection schemes. Another indirect form of involvement of armed actors is through what we call influence peddling and tax exemptions. If you know a high placed officer in the Congolese army and you want to import cars, that higher placed officer can put pressure on the customs authorities in order to either not pay any tax at all, import duties, or to significantly lower the amount. So what we also see is that armed actors influence the state administration in various ways through which you can actually gain business advantages. And finally, a third way is that this sort of the physical protection of armed forces is also important. In areas where there's insecurity, if you have to transport something, you pay sometimes armed groups that control the roads, also to avoid being ambushed. So what traders sometimes do is they pay off armed groups that operate along those roads in order not to be ambushed. We see a similar situation sometimes with shopkeepers. If you want to protect your shop, paying a bit to the armed forces or to armed groups can actually provide you with physical protection. So just to also briefly say that even at the level of ordinary citizens, we see these mechanisms of militarization. And this is particularly strong at the level of conflict resolution. There's a lot of conflicts in Eastern Congo, like family disputes around heritage, or around children, land conflicts, economic disputes about debts that have not been repaid. And what happens is that people solicit armed groups or the army to settle all kinds of conflicts, either against payment or because they have certain family or protection patronage ties with these armed groups. That basically means that once we look at militarizations, this is not a process that is uniquely driven by armed actors. It's also civilians that actually appeal to armed actors for protection and different kinds of services that actually drives this process. Now, because we have quite limited time, let me explain a couple of mechanisms that I have identified that are actually drivers of this process of militarization. And I've identified three here that I think are of paramount importance. The first is local security dilemmas. As I already explained, there are lots of different communities, often ethnic communities, that are in conflict with one another. And there is a generalized distrust towards the national armed forces. Now, what that means is if the community that you are opposed with has an armed group, you feel that you're at risk because that armed group can attack you and your community. As a result, you think it's justified and in fact very necessary to also support an armed group. So what we see is the security dilemma is something that was developed in international relations as occurring between states. But we actually see a quite similar logic happening at the local level in Eastern Congo between different communities. And that really is a driver of that facilitates all sorts of aspects, including these state formation processes that Raul talked about. A second element that I identified is collective action problems. So if you solicit an armed group or the army for your revenue generation scheme or because you are in conflict to gain the day in a particular conflict, you actually have a comparative advantage compared to your competitors. So they will also feel actually under pressure to take recourse to armed actors in order to back up their position. So you end in a situation where if you're an economic operator actually not soliciting the protection from armed actors, you will end up like, you know, being the losing party. And the second one is conflicts among civilians. These many conflicts also prohibit civilians from actually forming a united front in order to counter the influence of armed actors. And a third factor that I identified are logics of patronage / protection. In the Congo, these two logics merge a bit. So there's patron-client relations, whereby armed actors act as patrons and have civilians as clients. And there's protection relations, which is something that normally is identified in more the sort of organized crime literature, but I find that these two actually merge. Now, what happens with protectors? They thrive on insecurity. If there is no insecurity, nobody is going to solicit armed actors in order to protect them. So there's a direct, armed actors, of course, develop a vested interest in insecurity and violence continuing. The other thing is that patrons always are under pressure to generate resources which they have to distribute to their clients. And for army officers, for instance, this generates a big incentive in order to continue to generate revenue, which they often do through illegal forms of resources generation. And finally, this whole system of militarization leads armed actors to become involved in conflict resolution. But of course, that doesn't bring a real resolution of a conflict. It leads a particular solution to be imposed by force. What that does is it creates a lot of grievances, and those who are on the receiving end will actually in the future maybe seek other armed actors in order to redress the situation or take revenge. So in sum, if we look at East Congo as a sort of militarized social system, we see that there is lots of drivers that have become almost inherent to the system that cause its perpetuation. So root causes just do not provide a full picture of what is going on. In my opinion, we really need to analyze the strategies that people adopt to hedge against insecurity because they breed further insecurity. And also, just to repeat what I said at the start, in this system, I think there is limited direct international economic interest, but that doesn't mean that there's no international responsibility. And I want to be very clear for that. As was already highlighted by James in his presentation, the colonial legacy weighs very heavily on the current conflicts that we see. There's also other factors. If we look at the process of state implosion that happened under Mobutu Zaire, we see that structural adjustment schemes and the way in which international financial institutions also kept on lending to Zaire, which became massively indebted, all these factors actually related to the international political economy play a role in the lead up to and the reproduction of the current violence. And therefore, I think if I say that there's limited direct international business interest, it doesn't mean that there's no international responsibility. Now, finally, what are some of the policy implications of this? I think it's important. We often see peace-building activities that are focused on resolving conflict. So resolving land conflicts, resolving inter-community conflicts. And those activities are, of course, important, but they are not going to bring peace because insecurity as such also has to be recognized as a cause of further insecurity. And with that, I mean economic insecurity, political insecurity, as well as forms of social insecurity. Also, activities that are linked, like I said, peace building really focuses on conflict, but we have to focus also on the armed groups. They are not directly linked to the conflicts. And that is something that is often ill understood. Conflicts do not lead automatically to violence. So even if you resolve a land conflict, that may not get a particular armed group out of the bush, because these armed groups also very much have their own interests in being in the bush. In addition, I think we should start thinking of armed groups not as like isolated or just see the isolated military component, but look at them more as sort of broader social networks that encompass all these actors that I highlighted in this presentation. National politicians, even sometimes sponsors from neighboring countries, local authorities, all of these are part of broader militarized networks, and I think we should analyze those networks as a whole and not focus myopically only on the armed groups. And finally, addressing the weakness of civilian regulation and governance mechanisms, also in the economic sphere, is very important. Like I said, people often take their appeal to armed actors because there are no institutionalized satisfactory mechanisms of conflict resolution, including for commercial disputes. And I think that importantly adds to, or is an important incentive for people to actually start appealing to armed groups. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions, and I hope this brought any more clarity about why we see so many years of ongoing violence in Eastern DRC.
Thank you, Judith. This was really an extremely rich and in-depth analysis of the complexity of instability in this region. And we have received indeed questions in the chat, but unfortunately we are totally out of time and we need to proceed to the last part of the event. So maybe we can continue the discussion offline and keep following your research. I'm sorry there's not much room for exchange at this point, but yeah, we went a bit over. So thank you again for this incredibly thought-provoking analysis. And I would like to now leave the floor to the rector of Bocconi University, Gianmario Verona. Thank you to all the speakers, of course.